Wilson, the Executive Director with the Port of Klamath. I serve as your Legislative Committee Chair. What that really means is the staff does all of the work. I just come up here and introduce it, and then my job is to referee to make sure that you guys don't hurt each other while you're talking about politics. So there are a few issues out there that are bubbling up, and we just want to make sure that everybody remembers that we're all friends here. We're here to have a good, meaningful discussion and be respectful of one another. What we really want to do is find the common ground, the things that we agree on, that we can take to action in front of the legislature and advocate for, whether it's the legislature, the administration, whatever it is that we need to do. So one thing I would say is that James in particular and the rest of the staff, they've been working really hard to get out to a variety of the other communities to start the development of our program, our legislative agenda. And we've been doing phone calls, conference calls, so that it's easy for people to call into those meetings that might be far-flung in other parts of the state, trying to make it easier for everyone to engage in the legislative process. So I've been really appreciative of that and the efforts to do that. The other thing you're going to see is that the program our agenda is organized a little bit differently, trying to be a little more direct with how it's presented, bulleted items, and the development of that information. Also in the plan is to come up with some one-sheet flyers to address each one of these particular areas, or at least the ones that we need to advance more directly. That will enable you, as you're going to your individual legislators, to carry the things that are most important to you to your legislator without carrying the entire legislative agenda and having it get lost along the way. So we're trying to do some things new and experiment a little bit, and we're open to input and guidance as we continue to think about how things might work better with our legislature. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to the staff and let them start marching through the agenda.
All right. Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that. Again, for those of you I haven't met, I'm Victoria Lincoln, the Deputy Director here at the Ports Association. I'm thrilled to be here. Before I start, I just want to send out a shout out to those of you who showed up this morning for the fitness walk at the crack of dawn. We had a great time. My intent was to just go on down to the McMinimans and look around and tell you all that we walked up and down the Spanish Steps and come back and be done with it. So I told the group, now listen, we all need to tell everybody we did the Spanish Steps multiple times. Well, that was the wrong thing to do. Cheaters don't get honored. They made me go up and down those steps a couple of different times. Then we go over to Starbucks, and on the way back, just for good measure, they made me do another set of steps. So it doesn't pay to cheat with the ports. It was a really great group. We had a good time. And also I want to mention Missy. She was down there in the lobby before we started, had all the spread out, the juices and waters and everything, and then made sure that we all came back in one piece. So you all missed a great time. I hope next year you'll consider doing that walk with us. It was great. So with that, what we thought we would do today, just to make it more interesting, because the legislative process can be interesting. I know some of you find that hard to believe, but it's true. What we thought we would do is give you a little bit of 40,000-foot background about what the legislature grapples with, why they kind of behave the way they do, and then cover our issues that are important to us and give you some ideas about things that you can do over the next month before the legislature comes to town to help us out a little bit. So that's kind of going to be our approach today. We'll work off that list you have in a minute, but first we're going to cover a couple of kind of 40,000-foot issues, just to give you some flavor. So 2020 is a major election year. in case you're not paying attention. Hard to believe, but true. Maybe some people might not care about this. But it's a particularly big year because we have the president on the ballot. We have all 10 of our statewide congressional seats up. No Senate seat, but all 10 congressional seats. In the state, we have all of our major positions open. So that means the governor, the lieutenant governor, the secretary of state, the treasurer, the attorney general, the state auditor, the lands commissioner, the insurance commissioner. They're all up. Plus 3 judges off of our state Supreme Court, because they're on varying paths of election, so they're not all up at one time. In addition to that, you're going to find every House member in the legislature is up. They're up every 2 years. And half of the Senate, because their terms are 4 years. So we've got half of them. We have counties, judges, and lots of local elections. The ones that are not in the odd years, such as your positions. So I guess I would just say I would just leave you on this subject with 2 words: yard signs. Lots of yard signs. So it's going to be an interesting year, and the legislature keeps that in mind when they're in Olympia in the session right before the election. And part of the reason they do that is because it does put some pressure on them to get out there and campaign. I'll talk about that in a minute. So in the even year, well, first of all, let me back up for a minute. The legislature operates on a biennial budget. So the first year of the budget, they adopt an operating budget, a transportation budget, and a capital budget. And it's a 2-year process, and they come back in their midterm, they come back the second year for what I call a sort of a mid-course correction. Their budgeting process is different than what you might be familiar with. And so, people complain a lot about the legislature. It's easy to complain about them. But one thing to keep in mind is their budget process is not like yours. So when they leave town, they don't come back for a year. So you in the ports or any other local government, you're probably looking at your budgets regularly, right? When your commissions meet, don't you do a little review of how your budget is going? I serve on a board. I know that every time we meet, that's what we do. We do a little review of how our budget's going, and then we get on to other business. The legislature does not have that opportunity. Now, are there people paying attention to the state budget? Of course. The governor has an entire division devoted to it. The state legislature has a Ways and Means Committee and an Appropriations Committee staff who are paying close attention. You have the Department of Revenue. So people are paying attention. I don't mean to imply that, but the legislators, the policymakers themselves, get one more bite at the apple the following year. And then they write a new budget. So it's a little bit different than probably what you're familiar with, and I just wanted to point that out to you. So next time you want to complain about why they can't budget better than they do, it's a lot of money, and they only review it periodically. So the first year is 105 days, the second year is 60 days. We're coming into a 60-day session. Now, I don't know about you, but I wondered to myself many times, where did the 105 days come from? That was weird to me, and I couldn't get over it, so I had to do a little research. Most legislatures meet for 60 days. I should say at least the legislatures around the country where the states have lower populations. The bigger states, a lot of them, their legislatures meet all year round. But for a lot of the states, it's 2 months, 60 days, they're in and out. Usually it's January or February due to the agricultural economy that we've had in our country for centuries. So I think they wanted to give themselves a little extra time in their budget year. And think about it. 3 months is 90 days. 4 months is 120. What ends up in the middle? 105. the art of compromise. They probably disagreed with each other, had a little bit of a debate, came up with 105 days. So that's a little trivia for you next time you're in a cocktail party. Somebody might find that interesting. Or not. So, short session equals lower expectations. Again, we talked about everybody who's going to be on the ballot. This is mid-course correction on their budgets. They will deal with new issues that have come up since the end of last session. You never know year to year what our state Supreme Court will do or talk about, or what might happen in the interim, some disaster. Sometimes it's wildfires. It's all kinds of things. But generally speaking, that short session is get in and get out. They have another reason why they want to get out of town on the even years of the big election years, and that is they are limited in fundraising and campaign activities while they are in Olympia serving in the legislature. But their opponents are not. So their opponent, if you're in a hot contested seat, your opponent may be out there campaigning like crazy and fundraising while you're sitting in Olympia voting on policy issues. So that's another reason why they want to get in and get out, because they know their opposition is out there in the community working when they're not there. So some things the legislature has to take into consideration when they come to town, whether they're writing a full budget or a supplemental. Right now, I think they have to be paying attention to the state of the economy. Things seem good. They're not what they were a year ago, and there are some risk factors that are out there that they need to be paying attention to. For example, you all know this, I'm telling you something you all know more than I do, the tariffs. They are having an impact on our economy in this state. There's a global slowdown occurring. They need to be paying attention to that just like you all are. The MAX airplanes remain grounded. We have a chief economist in this state. His responsibility is to quarterly put out an economic and revenue forecast, and they time those forecasts to help the legislature and the governor adopt budgets and figure out how to spend the revenue that's coming in. So they have forecasts in either February or March, depending on whether it's a long year or a short year, one in June, one in September, and one in November. And the one in November was yesterday, as it turns out. The one in November is important because the governor's staff uses the information that comes out of the November forecast to develop either their budget or their supplemental budget. So now the information's out there. There was a press release yesterday. The council met, and now the governor's staff will put the finishing touches on their supplemental budgets and get them out the door in the next couple of weeks. My expectation is probably the second week of December, we'll see a supplemental budget from the governor. The governor starts out with a draft, and then it's either the House or the Senate, whoever's in charge of the budgets that year, they will come out with one later in session. They will wait till the February or March forecast and then put theirs out, and then the debate will be on to get out the door at the end of the 105 or the 60-day session. So what did our state economist say? His name is Steve Lurch. I think he's a funny guy, and it occurred to me we should get him to come in here and talk to you all sometime in the future. He's really entertaining and an interesting person. He put out a press release yesterday, and I'll quote you a couple of lines from it just to give you a flavor for what he's thinking. The level of uncertainty remains high, with downside risks outweighing upside risks. Downside risks outweighing upside risks. Our economy is not where it was a year ago. I think that's what he's saying. Another quote, Washington's economy continues to outperform the nation, but not as dramatically. So they're seeing some changes. They think their risk factors are out there. For you all planning your budgets at your ports, you might want to be paying attention to that. I know the legislature will. I think all governmental entities should be paying close attention to that. And remember what happened in the last recession. I'm not saying, do not quote me, I am not saying we're going into a recession. We could have a downturn, we could have a market correction, we could have a recession, we don't know. But we are certainly in the longest expansion period in the history of our state since the Great Depression. We passed that milestone in August of 2018. So I think people are just anticipating that we're going to have some changes here and that we have a cyclical process. What goes up must come down, and so there's probably a correction in our future. The legislature has to be paying attention to that, we hope. Another thing that they've been grappling with for the past nearly a decade, is education funding. If you open the newspapers at all in the last 8 years, you could not miss this subject. It was called the McCleary decision, based on a family who argued that the state of Washington was not funding its basic education responsibilities. It literally, my colleagues could probably attest to this, sucked the air out of the room for a very long time. The court decision was in 2012. I would argue that probably the legislature finalized their activities last year. So that was nearly a decade of debating about what is basic education, what is our responsibility, and how are we going to pay for it. So a couple of things to keep in mind about that. The court determined that the state of Washington failed to meet the state constitutional duty to make ample provision for the education of all children. So, between 2012 and 2019, here's what the legislature did to deal with this. They raised the statewide property tax levy and required local school districts to lower their levies. Remember, this is about special levies. They're called special levies for a reason. They are supposed to be for special activities, not funding basic education like teacher salaries, classroom sizes, and the like. So finally, the state legislature said, enough, stop doing that. But it required the state to take over the levy collections for education and then get special levies back to their original responsibilities, which is special activities. In addition, they put new funding into all-day kindergarten. They lower the class sizes in kindergarten through third grade. If you have kids or grandkids in school, you know that some of those classrooms were 30 kids. They're now down around 24 or 25. In addition, they increased funding for materials and supplies, and the big daddy of the whole thing, they raised teacher salaries. It was one of the last things they did. In my mind, working over at the cities, we could never get anything done because McCleary, basic education. In the meantime, Western State Hospital got decertified. Homelessness increased by how much? You all know. It's stunning what has happened out there. Mental health services, all kinds of things. And I think for ports, it's about infrastructure, transportation, and funding and tools for you all. They didn't pay much attention to those activities while they were grappling with the McCleary decision. So, I think we can say that in 2020, we finally have put that behind us. But the reason why I call it the hangover is because think to yourself, how much do you think they invested in that? So the other day, James and I were talking in his office and I said, I think they invested $10 billion. And a friend of ours was sitting here and he goes, well, let's just ask somebody on the Hill, a committee staffer. I happen to have somebody on speed dial. We'll ask them. The answer came back, $24 billion. And I said, that cannot be right. So I called a friend of mine in the governor's office. I said, I just heard this number. And she said, what's the number? I said, $24 billion. And she goes, right on the money. So think about that for a minute. The state budget's $45 billion for a 2-year period. And since 2012, they've spent $24 billion on this McCleary decision. That's why we talk about it as a hangover, sucking the air out of the room, not getting other things done. That's how much they invested in that. So now I think we can move forward from that. That's what I'm hopeful about. So enough about education funding. I hope we can move on to other things that are more important to you. We do have a new Speaker of the House. And Chris is going to start out talking about the initiative that was on the ballot and then go into the issues that he covers on our handout that you have. But let me just say something about the speaker. People say to me, why do we care? I mean, okay, positions change, right? Well, this position hasn't changed in 20 years. We have had the longest running Speaker of the House in the state of Washington's history. And he has things he was interested in and things he wasn't interested in. And perhaps you've been paying attention to tax increment financing. You would know that's one of the things he was not interested in. So it's a new opportunity and a new day. In addition to being the longest running speaker in the state of Washington, he's the second longest running speaker in the nation. So speakers usually last two years, 4 years, maybe 6. I don't ever remember anyone going longer than 4 years, except this one. But it's a new day. It's going to be a new look. They're going to approach things differently. The new speaker is also first time ever the state of Washington's had a woman in the position, Lori Jenkins. She's from Tacoma. So it's going to be interesting to see how that affects things. So at this point, I think, you'll want to hear about the initiative from Chris. He does an excellent job describing the effects of that and why you should care about that. We'll go through the items that are on your list that we've handed out. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about some things that you can do when you go back home after this conference is over that you could do for us to help us between now and January when the legislature comes back. And we'll take questions at the end. Is that all right with you, Mark? Okay. There you go.
Thank you, Victoria. I'm Chris Herman. I do trade and transportation policy for you this morning, and I'm probably bringing a pretty dire message, but we'll try to get through it and look on the bright side. Challenges always incent opportunities. I like to say we had a hole in transportation funding in the state, and now we have a big hole. So, right, pain induces action, perhaps. So thank you. We can't start a conversation without talking about I-976. And it's really important for you to know that this is very much an evolving issue. We are consistently schedule our meetings here, our annual meeting with you all. At the very same time, legislators are meeting in Olympia. So there were meetings even just yesterday where discussions around impacts of 976 and maybe even hints of options and possibilities for addressing that issue were discussed even just yesterday. So this is a very much an immediate issue and something everyone is really talking about. So I-976 is otherwise known as the IMIN initiative or the $30 car tab fee initiative. Has passed. It's currently at about a 53-47, not anywhere near enough votes to change that outcome. And so, again, this reduces your car tab fee to $30. It does much, much more than that. It addresses other tax, vehicle taxes that you pay when you're purchasing a new vehicle. Locally, there's over 60 communities that have transportation benefit districts, and this wipes that out. Those are now illegal, even though many of them have been passed locally. On your local ballot, you've passed these, and now a state initiative has wiped those out. So the overall impact, 6-year impact, is about $4.2 billion. That's both state and local impacts. That doesn't include the real target IMIN had, which is Sound Transit, which is actually much larger impact to that agency. Is they're actually instructed to unwind bonding that they've already have gone out and secured. We've got since the initiative has passed, the governor, along with the Secretary of Transportation, Millar, have come out and said that they will are really looking for the legislature to give them guidance on projects, and as a result, they have are delaying projects that have not essentially been let or have been executed. And so, and I'm hearing from many of you some real concerns about this. And so we're actually, we'll be convening a small group of you to make sure we get more details about that, and that we can address, really have some detailed talking points around how the implementation of transportation funding is going. I've heard some really disconcerting stories of decisions that have been made even back into the summer around potentially delaying projects that were about to be let, and now they're actually the moratorium by the governor is delaying those indefinitely. Lawsuits. The constitutionality of the amendment is a big question and certainly up in the air. The initial complaint that I've seen from local owners, including the Port of Seattle, looks to place an injunction on the execution or it becoming law, the initiative becoming law. So your car tabs were supposed to be reduced starting December 5th. If the injunction is placed, that will, what I hear is that Department of Licensing will continue to collect the fee, but have to retain it in a separate account and possibly have to return it to you. It's very messy at this point. And there are many different constitutional questions that are being addressed. I won't go into all of them, but two of them is, I mentioned that the initiative addresses multiple fees, both local and state. Well, that in and of itself is an issue on state initiatives. It takes multiple subject matters within the same initiative, and that is not allowed. There is the state Supreme Court has ruled several times on that in the past, and so that appears to be a clear avenue, and certainly one that this initial lawsuit is going after. The second is, I have also mentioned, is the local taxing authority, where you've already approved your transportation benefit district locally, and then the will of the state usurps your local authority. So that will also likely be a challenge. We've heard potentially from the contracting community and construction communities that, hey, we're up in limbo, so there may be projects that they've already feel have been granted construction rights and may be delayed or slowed down. And so there's a lot of concern from those folks as far as how that will impact our economy and the way we're constructing projects going forward. So we can address any questions certainly in our open question and answer session, but it is definitely evolving. What we know is it's a $450 million impact to our current 2-year budget. That's about 16% of the budget. It's also an uneven impact because it only addresses these additional fees. It doesn't address gas tax, which many of our road construction projects are predominantly funded through gas tax, but not exclusively. And so you will likely see an uneven impact if and when the legislature takes action addressing the issue. So I'll just give you three quick possible scenarios that we could see, and the reality is it could be these, and it could be a combination of these. So we could get many multiple ways the legislature could respond. First, they could look for new revenue to come up and bridge that 6-year, $4.2 billion shortfall. So they could raise the gas tax or find other fees that are perceived legal at this point until somebody challenges those. So that's one way. They could do nothing. They could say, let the courts work this out. We're going to stick to our existing 2-year budget, even though it has a hole in it. But we're going to expect that the court will deal with this and address this, and not have to step out and make a decision until the decision's made in the court. And so that's the second option. And then a third option is they could do nothing. So the nothing really, or they could make cuts. Excuse me. That's the third option, is they could look to reduce the budget by that 16% and either cut projects or delay them, push them into future years. And so those are, again, the three main options that they would have. And again, we could really see any combination of those playing out. We're hearing all of those, frankly. We're hearing, even just yesterday, one thing that is addressed in a roundtable this afternoon on the road usage charge. We call it the gas tax is dead. What's next for transportation funding? There's even a proposal to initiate a road usage charge and have a bill this legislative session. So we're hearing a lot of things, and it's really, again, a very evolving topic. So leading then into transportation funding, where does this leave us? It leaves us in this hole. And so we'll have to be very cognizant and diligent in making sure that we're at the table when those conversations are happening, and that we're weighing in as an association. And that is us, but it is also you. And so if you're seeing those local impacts of decisions that are being made at the executive branch, please let us know. It's very important information that we're able to receive from you as to how this is impacting you directly. There's a few other transportation-related issues that we'll be looking at. We're a bit on the defense as it comes to the Freight Mobility Strategic Investment Board, FMSIB. FMSIB has been around 20 years. Ports have played a significant role in the creation of that board. And frankly, this isn't the first time that the legislature has looked at this board and said, do we really need this? And we have always, as a community, come together and said, absolutely, we need this. And we partner with our local governments, both the cities as well as the counties, who are frankly more reliant on this funding even than we are. But we know that the Freight Mobility Board is the board that gives us seed money for projects that are significant to the state and important for freight. And so we have heard from Representative Fye, who's the chair of House Transportation, that he has concerns about FMSIB and its timeliness for spending money and getting projects complete. So we have proposed, and you'll see in our legislative agenda, a few reforms that the board is looking at and considering, and we are endorsing. Secondarily, it's important to note that there's a question about the structure of the board, and some work underway to potentially move the board from a governor cabinet member to potentially to moving the board under and within WashDOT's purview. And we have some real concerns about that. That's frankly why the board was created in the first place, was a dissatisfaction by the freight community on how DOT was able to respond to local projects. I've also heard a lot from you all in the last couple of days about how important that is, and actually even individual projects within your purview and your interest that frankly will rely on that money in the future. So we have a clear need for this program going forward, and we'll certainly intend to keep it alive and keep it relevant through some reforms. Lastly, what I'll address quick is general aviation funding. We actually have two bills that are currently still alive from last session, as in our 2-year budget cycle, bills stay alive in the second session. So we're flipping the order this year on importance, partly because what we're hearing at the federal level is that the state is out of compliance with its collection of certain fuel taxes. The state's required to, by the FAA, to put those fuel taxes back into aviation infrastructure. The state's been out of compliance and has known about it for about 6 years. And has exacerbated that situation by extending and actually increasing a few of these taxes just last year. It's a complicated story for us because one of those taxes actually happens to be the seed money for MODCA. So we're playing a bit of a game, and we are here to not only make that program whole, but we're looking as an offset for the funding out of the hazardous substance tax. We're looking to redivert 1% of the fuel tax, aviation fuel tax, back into aviation. It's currently going to the general fund. So that is our position, and we'll be sticking strictly to that position going forward in this session. And then we've also stood up the CARB program last year, very successful, $5 million into the Community Aviation Revitalization Loan Program. That also has a board that's been stood up. They actually, if you have an airport and are looking, they have actually an ongoing call for projects out there right now. And we should be hearing shortly how the first round of reviews go here shortly. But it's a good program. Right now, it's only stood up as a 2-year program, and so House Bill 1456 creates that program permanently into the future. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jerry to discuss environmental issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. My name is Jerry O'Keefe, and I handle environmental affairs on behalf of our member ports. It's amazing how much is going on in transportation. Every time I hear Chris talk about it, it kind of makes my head spin. And there are a few things going on in environment, but I don't think quite as many or quite as deep as what you just heard. I'm going to start out with an issue that we've talked about in the past. It has to do with the state's Environmental Policy Act as it relates to greenhouse gases. I think the thumbnail on this is that the State Environmental Policy Act, SEPA, requires an analysis when projects are done of the impacts associated with those projects. And of course, increasingly people are aware of greenhouse gases and the impacts that they have, not only in the state of Washington, but obviously globally. But a couple of decisions were made, 2 of them in the court system, 1 of them administratively by the Department of Ecology, that have left all of us, not just all of us, but anybody who proposes a project of any kind that has opposition, vulnerable to legal challenges. This isn't just a fossil fuel issue. It's not strictly speaking, a refinery or something like that. The issue that we have runs much deeper. We can't answer 2 questions that you have to answer when you develop an environmental impact statement. First, are the emissions from this project significant? And secondly, if they're significant, what's the appropriate mitigation for us to take to address those impacts. And absent a structure, a framework, some guidance from the state, either the Department of Ecology or the state legislature, we can't answer those two questions. So what we've asked for, I'm going to just, before I move on to that, I'm going to give an example. Let's say you're building a building in downtown Seattle, which happens, I guess, from time to time from the number of cranes I see there. And you run into some kind of resistance of one kind and another, and they challenge that action. How deep is your analysis required to go? Do you have to look at where the steel was made and what the emissions were associated with mining the iron ore and manufacturing the steel product? How about the glass in the building? How about the cooking that goes on in that facility? And the other life cycle impacts that occur when people live or work in a building, including the commute. If that building significantly raises the value of land in downtown Seattle, which they do tend to do, does that displace people that now have to commute farther to get to work and result in additional carbon emissions in that regard? So where is that line? What is required to determine what the analysis is and what's significant? And we just don't know. The honest answer is we don't know what the answer to that is. We know that if we have to litigate it, that we're going to get a range of answers to the question, and it's going to take a long time to address. So what are we asking for? Ports don't have, at this point, the answer on this question. We can't. It's a bigger conversation. The development community, other local governments have a valid point of view. PUDs have a point of view. Obviously, the environmental community has a point of view. The tribal community has a point of view, and we got to sit down and talk to each other. That's what we're asking for. We want to have a table where we can sit down and try to think through, all right, how do we want to do this? How is it going to work? What recommendations would we make to a governor and the legislature to create a framework that allows us to evaluate any project that comes up before us? So that's what we're headed towards. That's what we're trying to get done. Early, encouraging conversations right now, both with the governor's office and with the legislature. It's interesting and good, I think, that we had the Puyallup tribe visit with us today, because last session we sort of snatched defeat from the jaws of victory when the Puyallups came in and pretty much shut down that conversation. Having them here for at least me on this issue on your behalf is a helpful step. That kind of relationship helps us move forward, at least on this issue. We're also paying attention to a study that was done by the Ruckelshaus Center. The Ruckelshaus Center is named after Bill Ruckelshaus, who I'm sure many of you remember from the Watergate years, part of the Saturday Night Massacre, and a great man who I really love. Their task is to find places where they can mediate or find center of gravity on a range of issues. One of the issues that they were asked to do by the legislature was to take another look at the Growth Management Act and dust it off and see where it's headed for the future. I've read that report. And I've talked to a number of my colleagues from different perspectives about that report. I think the common understanding is it's more of a recitation of what they heard from a lot of different points of view than a set of crisp recommendations about what needs to be done. I am not picking up a lot of energy coming out of that report. Just the same, there's some things we got to pay attention to. The report says that ports ought to be brought into capital facility planning, economic development planning, and other kinds of local and regional government planning as a part of those other local governments' planning processes. We don't know what that means. We don't know what that looks like, but we know we have a stake in that conversation, that we need to pay attention to that conversation. So it might create opportunities. We're going to have here shortly a conversation about industrial land preservation. Listen to a panel who I think is quite good. Hope is quite good. Talk to us about those issues. But again, that might be an opportunity. If you're going to talk about the Growth Management Act, that may be a place where, from our point of view, we can be constructive. There's other issues with the State Environmental Policy Act and infill housing in urban areas. It's a place where it's really interesting to watch. Doesn't affect us as directly, but when you hear the environmental community want to shut down a part of the state's Environmental Policy Act as it relates to a development decision, it always, it's one of those things that stands out in your mind. For me, it's sort of probably one of the most unusual things that I've seen in my career on working on environmental issues. There are a number of recommendations coming out of the governor's killer whale, Southern Resident Killer Whale Task Force. We saw those in the last session. This is in their final year, their second year. They've made a number of other recommendations. I want to thank Steve Johnston from the Port of Edmonds, where Steve, thank you so much for serving on the task force this year. We appreciate it. He followed Kathy Pittis, who had the great pleasure of serving on the task force in the first year. I think you were ably represented by those folks, talking about issues from your point of view. The feedback, again, from us related to the task force was, hey, you got to prioritize what you're up to. There should be some way of paying for some of the things that you've talked about if you're going to be serious about it. We're concerned about the kinds of impacts, the significant impacts that we see among our members related to dam removal. And there are other specific recommendations that did not get the kind of discussion that, in our view, they should have gotten. We don't know what they mean. It's not that there's necessarily bad ideas there, except we don't know what they mean. So we'll be paying attention to some of those recommendations, some of which are priorities for the Washington Environmental Council. And I've already started talking with their legislative liaison about some of those issues, trying to get a little bit more clarity about what it is they're looking for. I'm going to just talk briefly about the Model Toxics Control Act and accounts that received a lot of attention in the last session. Actions were taken to stabilize the revenue streams from those sources, to keep their buying power consistent. We'll be paying attention to that because there's actually more money available for toxics cleanups that ports do as a result of that bill. But we just heard Chris talk about transportation funding, and we already are. The linkage between transportation and the Model Toxics Control Act and its revenue source, the hazardous substance tax, was established in a precedent-setting way as a part of this reform. $50 million a year, a biennium, is taken off the top for stormwater projects in the transportation system. When they have their backs against the wall, the MOTCA accounts are often one of the targets they come looking for to pay for transportation funding. That's something we really have to pay attention to and try to get to sort through as we try to make sure that we have the funding and resources we need to do the cleanups that have really been used for economic development purposes in our members. So I think those are the highlights. There are a lot of other things that are cooking out there. But thanks for your time.
Okay, we'll talk about a couple of more topics, and then we want to get to the exciting part, what you're going to do over the next month to help us before legislative session starts. So, economic development. The issues under here, I'm not going to go through all the details because these are topics you have seen on your list in the past, and we're paying close attention. CURB, for example, obviously a great program. We want to continue to advocate for its viability, and we'll pay any attention to subjects that are bills or proposals that may alter that program or impact it negatively in any way, of course. Same with broadband funding. There's been a lot of activity on broadband. It's going to be a multi-year effort. It's going to take a lot of money, and we'll be paying close attention to that on your behalf. Tax increment financing. If you were in one of the committee meetings yesterday, a Department of Revenue employee gave a rundown on the programs on the books in the state of Washington relating to tax increment financing. To me, it was very fascinating. It demonstrated that there are a number of statutes that already have allow for this kind of activity. It's just been stymied in one way or another. Some of the programs are no longer funded. So I need to take a closer look at all of those and look for opportunities to beef up some of those existing tools, see if there's any interest in the legislature. You heard me talk about the Speaker of the House change there. Perhaps there's an opportunity going forward this coming session or in years to come. The 0.09 sales tax for use in rural areas. There was talk in the legislative committee of expanding that for some of the border communities. I know Vancouver and Spokane and possibly Bellingham, if I'm not mistaken, have an interest in seeing this get expanded. There's lots of opinions on that in this group. So we'll see where that goes in the conversation. I think there's more conversation that needs to occur on that. Finally, innovative partnership zones. Again, that's another tool that's on the books. It's not funded. It's sitting there stalled. If there are opportunities to get that kind of thing rolling again, we will look for those opportunities during legislative session. Work with legislators going forward to decide how we can shake up some of these tools and get them moving again. That would be one of them. On the governance issue, real quick, prevailing wages, we are hearing from you that it is costing you more money for projects. We're hearing it loud and clear. What I would be interested in is hearing from you with some actual data or anecdotal stories about what the impacts are in your communities. And I do want to caution you, this probably is not the legislature to ask to roll back anything on prevailing wages. I'm just guessing here. I just don't think these are the folks that are going to want to do that. But what they should hear from you is how is this impacting you on a day-to-day basis back in your communities? It's our responsibility to point that out to them. And so if you have some examples, you could email me. We will look for opportunities to let the legislators know that there are some negative consequences here and that they need to be aware of them. I just am cautioning you not to get your hopes too high that right at this moment, this would be one of those things we could get a major change on, because I don't see that happening in this legislature. Public Works contracting, I'll skip over that and go on to the emerging issues. This morning in the executive group, they talked about the elections of local elected officials, the idea of moving all elections into the even year. We're going to pay close attention to that. I can foresee some challenges with that. For example, if you got a ballot that was 3 or 4 pages long and the ports and the fire commissioners and the school board members were all at the bottom, that's probably not serving its purpose. So we have some things to say about that. Again, it's kind of a new topic, as James mentioned, and I'd love to hear your feedback on that. But I think the issues are, number one, it's going to make the ballot really long, and the local governments are going to get lost in the noise. And secondly, I think it might have an impact on the county offices that prepare the ballots and work through the elections, because you're going to be moving all their work activity to a 6-month period out of every 2 years. So I'm just thinking in advance with the counties, they might find that problematic. So we'll find out. Those are the issues for you that the legislative committee has talked about and dealt with. I do want, if we have time, I know we're running short, to take questions, but you know your staff is here. Anytime you can approach any of us. It's helpful if you write your stuff down on your business card. We could take it back to the office and get back to you later. We don't want to shortchange anybody, but it is important to talk about what you can do between now and legislative session. It's worth pointing out that if you wait until you meet with a legislator in their office during legislative session to introduce a subject to them, probably your subject is dead. They have 15-minute increments all day long in committee meetings. They're tired. They're hearing a lot of data and details, and they're meeting a lot of new people. That is not the time to introduce yourself to them. The time to introduce yourself to them, if you don't already know them, and I suspect the majority of you do know them, but is in the next month. Or maybe you should have been working on it last July or August, but we do have a month. And so I encourage you to call them up, invite them over to the port for coffee, show them your project, talk to them about your big issues in the next 5 or 6 weeks. And then if you need to speak to them during legislative session, when you walk in the door, you'll say, remember what we talked about? Here's the update on that. Here's how you can help us. So please don't wait until Port Day to introduce a topic to them or to have talked to them for the first time in a year or more. That's not the most effective use of their time or your time. So I invite you to get out there and get on the phone and offer them a cup of coffee. They love that. Please plan to attend the Port Day. We're planning some really exciting things, and it's always a good time to walk around the Capitol and see what's going on. And finally, I would suggest that you read all the material that comes from James on the Director's Engagement Initiative. And the reason why is because if some of these activities are not working well, or you want us to beef up in certain areas, you need to tell us what that is. Next interim, we'll look at how we're approaching things and going to make some changes based on the feedback we're getting from you. So he's really anxious that people give him some feedback on how you think things are going in the legislative program and in other areas, and see what we can do there. So there's some things that you can do. Consider being part of the legislative committee in the future. It's a good group. They cover a lot of ground. We're trying ways to engage folks so you don't have to travel as far. But those are my suggestions to you in order to get participation up and get a broader sense of what the interests are by this group. So with that, I'm not sure what time I've got. Go ahead.
Well, is this okay? Here we go. We have a half-hour break scheduled for right now, so I'd like to borrow about 5 minutes of that and throw it out there for some questions and comments. So does anybody have anything? Right here in front. We need to run the microphone down.
Here, I'll turn these on.
Check. Okay. So I've got 2 more years to run on my commissionership. So I'm going to be a broken record. I spent my entire career as a telecommunications engineer and consultant, and I registered 2 of the first .coms in the world back when. Ports have to do 2 things. They have to provide access and to the water, and they have to provide economic development. From my perspective, once a company finds a place to build something, to do something in your port district, there's two things that stand in the way, and especially this is true in rural districts, is that where are the people that are going to work for me, where are they going to live? That's kind of number one. And number two is, how am I going to communicate with the rest of the world? And this broadband in rural communities issue has gotten so much lip service. And if you look at the legislation that's out there and the funding resources are out there, it allows public agencies to do stuff in collaboration with telecoms, or it's only available for telecoms, or it's only available but you can only do certain things. There's two things that government agencies should do. Government agencies should do things that private enterprise can't do, and government agencies should do things that private companies will not do. In a rural district, if there's no broadband, it's not about Netflix. It's about telemedicine. It's about telelearning. It's about disenfranchisement of the electorate. If you cannot deal with your government, if you don't have network access, reliable network access, you can't work with your government. You can't get information, and you can't provide feedback. And I appreciate all the things that has kind of come and laid some of this groundwork, but it's time to take the handcuffs off. If you don't have a rational expectation that broadband is ever going to come to your community, it's time for the legislators to quit this nonsense, this fiction of support for rural broadband. It's like saying, I run an ice cream parlor. Every Saturday night, every Martian that comes to the door is going to get a free ice cream cone. Well, come on. It'd be really nice that if people that grew up in our community and went away to college and learned something and want to come back home, if they don't drive a tractor, if they don't build a boat, they just don't have a place here. And I'm really tired of it. And I think that the public ports in the state need to stand up and say, take the handcuffs off. You can work it out so that enterprise can come in after the fact, after the market's built, and come back in again, be a partner, but it's not okay for them to stand in the way.
Thank you. We're going to want to get a few other folks going. Other questions, comments? We got one.
How about just a comment? So the Tri-Cities community would like to invite everybody. Thank you. To save the date, January 13th, we'll be having a dam public hearing. Before the dam public hearing, we'll have a dam rally. So we'd love for people to come out and join us. There'll be dam T-shirts. It's going to be a damn bunch of fun. So January 13th, please come join us. Thanks.
All right. Anybody else? All right. Oh, we got one more right up here.
Just a quick question. You said that I lost my train of thought here, but there was one legislature that was pushing this business of on-year elections. Got to be a reason.
So we're trying to get to the bottom of that. I heard it at a local government association meeting. Chris and Jerry and I were there, and in addition, I think James said he heard it at a meeting with some of the executive directors of some of the other local governments. We're hearing a buzz, and there are a couple of legislators that are paying attention to local governments in general. One House member, one senator, and so we think it's one of those two, or maybe both. So we'll get more information and we'll get to the bottom of it, and would love to hear your comments on what you think. If we haven't identified what those major issues are to you, tell us what they are, above and beyond the fact that the ballot's going to be 5 pages long and problematic for those at the bottom, obviously. So.
All right. Well, we've stolen. Oh, we'll do one more, and then we'll take a break.
Eric LeBrand, Port of Vancouver. If there's one thing I hate, it's playing defense, and that includes on the legislative side of things. We're talking about dam removal, greenhouse gas emissions. Last year we had I-1631, and I'd really like for us to maybe look at having a discussion. We've got a lot of risks with playing defense and potential uneven implementation of different measures. I'd really like for us to have a discussion around what we as a body want to do in getting ahead of the climate change discussion and issue, so that we're not playing defense on that in other areas as well, because it's going to continue to come up.
Great. All right. Well, we've stolen enough of your break, so we'll let you go. Feel free to catch me or any of the staff if you have any other issues or questions, concerns. Thank you. We'll be back here at 10:30.